Okay. Well, hello everyone. Welcome to the virtual edition of We Robot 2020, the premier international conference on law and policy relating to robotics. It's hosted this year by the University of Ottawa Centre for Law, Technology and Society. Before we get started, I need to thank our wonderful sponsors who have been very patient and understanding as we reimagine this year's conference due to the global pandemic. We Robot 2020 is presented with the generous support of Microsoft, CIFAR, X, and Intel, as well as the University of Ottawa, the University of Washington Technology Policy Lab, and Miami Law. For those who are not familiar with the We Robot format, please note that the authors do not present their own work. Instead, the session discussants read the author's paper in advance of the conference and present the author's work to the audience, while offering constructive thoughts for improvement and seeding the conversation that follows. Authors then have 5 minutes to respond to discussants' feedback. Then we invite the discussant and author to engage in a casual discussion using this format. So for the virtual edition, we invite the audience to engage with the papers in the comments section below. For this session, we're delighted to welcome as discussant Peter Asaro, an associate professor of media studies at the New School, to present Beyond in the Loop on the role of meaningful human control in high-stakes machine-human partnerships. The author that we have to present the paper today is Liam McCoy from the University of Toronto. And the other authors who unfortunately were not able to be with us today are Jacqueline Burkell at the University of Western Ontario, Dallas Card at Stanford, Brent Davis from the University of Western Ontario, Judy Gachoya, who's at Emory, Sophie LePage, who's at the University of Ottawa, and David Madras at the University of Toronto. I'm looking forward to this discussion. Meaningful human control is a topic that's near and dear to my heart. I've worked on it in the past myself. And with that, I'm going to turn things over to Peter for his presentation of the paper.
Great, thank you, Jason. Thanks to all the We Roboters who put this all together, despite the conditions of the pandemic. So this is a very interesting paper from Liam et al. On meaningful human control. And it really tries to take the concept of meaningful human control, which emerged out of discussions at the United Nations around autonomous weapons, and what kind of legal requirements or restrictions are really required around that, and really tries to expand that into other areas of significant or meaningful sorts of algorithmic decision-making / human-machine teaming, and to ask really what does this concept mean in these other domains? Is it relevant? How is it relevant? Where does it fall down? And how do we really start thinking about it? And I think this is really useful as a paper and as an approach, because I do think meaningful human control is highly relevant in a lot of different human-machine decision processes, as well as human-machine teaming in order to perform various tasks. So it's a useful thing to think about. And they do a pretty good job, I think, of analyzing or teasing out some of the key elements of meaningful human control and how it's understood, including a nice list of criteria, and then looking at kind of this bigger breakdown between two, I think, big aspects of meaningful human control, the performance side of it and the responsibility side of it. And then they apply this in a couple of case studies, one on autonomous driving or autonomous vehicles, and the other in radiology diagnostics. So, of course, meaningful human control coming out of these UN debates, even within that debate, there's a lot of misunderstanding, confusion, different things that are meant by it. Generally speaking, of course, there's humans in control at some level. I'll come back to what control might mean or why that's complicated. And then there's this issue of meaningful and what is meaningful. And as I've written about before, I think the meaningful part of this is that humans are meaningfully engaged in activity. They understand what's happening with the systems that they're using, and they can be responsible kind of legally and morally for the implications of those actions because they understand and are engaged in a particular way, which we use the word meaningful. You could use other words. You could parse that a little bit differently. There's also a debate within that about what does that mean a particular human being, and this is what they call the narrow sense of meaningful human control, that there's a specific human who's in control of a system, or is it this broader notion that's been pushed by, I'll call it the Dutch school, because there's a lot of Dutch researchers who work on this concept, who want a broader view of just humans in general being in control, which means the software that we've put in place to control some operation or machine is a sufficient form of meaningful human control. They stick more with the narrow version. The other aspect, of course, of meaningful is that it's not meaningless, or as they call perfunctory. So it has to be non-perfunctory. And that's this example I've used before, which is if you're sitting alone in a dark room and a red light comes on and you press a button to approve some automatic process or decision, you're sort of a human who controls it by pressing a button, but you don't really know what the decision is or the context or the meaning or the significance. And in that sense, it's not meaningful. So that's at least a minimal, I would say, requirement of meaningfulness. And then they go on with the 5 more criteria, which they list. I'll sort of summarize as sort of understanding, that you can understand the system, the human understands the system, and the actions that they can take with the system or through the system. The second one is oversight, that they're able to monitor and predict the operations of any autonomous functions or machine actions and their consequences. And I think that's a little bit trickier, the consequences. People can't always predict the consequences of their own actions. They try to anticipate that and take actions accordingly, but if that's a real requirement, that could be very significant or steep kind of requirement. The third is action control, so that the human has to be capable of making decisions and exert control over the system. So this is also might be effective control, is how we often talk about that. And again, they say control over actions and consequences. Generally speaking, we can control our actions, but not necessarily always the consequences of those actions. The fourth is the meaningful bit, which they take criteria 2 and 3 in combination. So again, that it's not perfunctory and that there's a certain autonomy being exercised by the human. I think that also becomes a complex issue. What is autonomy? When do humans have it? Do we really want humans to have it? Especially when we're talking in a military context, we're generally talking about soldiers following orders. There's a sense of a space of autonomy for them to interpret those orders and execute what they believe the commander's intent might be. But we also don't really want them kind of going off the range and doing whatever they want, nor do we want our machines to really go off the range. So what is that sort of autonomy, and what do we mean by that here? And the 5th criteria is this kind of ongoing, continual quality of it, which is that it's not pre-programmed or pre-decided. Okay, and so then they kind of break this down into a bunch of different pros and cons around performance aspects of why you'd want meaningful human control, and the responsibility elements. However, I think one of the strength of the paper is the discussion of the performance side, and the weakness of the paper is the discussion of the responsibility side, I would say. So on the positive side, humans have situational understanding and contextual understanding. They're really good at dealing with these kinds of cases that are outside the normal distribution, is what they refer to it, or as novel cases that an algorithm might not have ever seen before. Algorithms don't really know what to do with them. And if you've ever been on a sort of phone bank kind of situation, they give you option 1, 2, and 3, and if none of those things sort of satisfy your options, it can be very frustrating. They used to have option 0 where you can talk to the human, right? Or for any other question, press 0. And that's that sort of, how do you catch all of those things that you can't anticipate in advance? And you really need a human to kind of deal with it on a one case-by-case basis. And that's a really sort of important performance thing for a lot of different kinds of operations. The negative side of that is having humans making these decisions can affect the predictability of systems. So if you're talking about cars driving down the road, humans make all kinds of unpredictable actions. You can't really anticipate what they're going to do. If you could pre-program all the cars to behave in a particular way, we could, fly through intersections at full speed and avoid collisions, but we can't really do that with humans in control, right? And then the other element of that is time. And this comes up a lot in the military discussions, that humans just don't really have enough time to process the decision and the information that's available to them to make the right decision or the best decision. They get into later a bunch of other human factors, concerns about the capability, automation bias, the quality of the decision making, the quantity of information, and all these other things that having a human in place sort of makes it difficult. And then you have the responsibility side of things. And again, I think this is the weaker part of the paper. The positive they identify is that the humans would be able to apply empathy and emotional understanding and awareness to decisions. And that's potentially a valuable thing, although there's that flip side of it, which is the negative, which is that you introduce bias, and that could be explicit or implicit biases that person might hold towards whatever kinds of decisions they're making. And then there's also the emotional labor and potentially the emotional harm that comes from being burdened by those kinds of responsibilities. And then, of course, what Madeline Clara Lish at Previous We Robots has called the moral crumple zone, where we sort of set up a human being to be the morally responsible agent who takes responsibility for the system that they don't necessarily control or have any understanding of. And that's, again, a kind of a negative. Okay, so I think that's a good breakdown, this sort of to separate out the performance aspects from the responsibility aspects. But I think they could have gone much deeper into why responsibility is important. And both of the cases that they look at, the self-driving car and the medical diagnostics, I think they don't really make the case very strongly for why you want responsibility in those cases, why you need a human to be responsible as an agent, as opposed to maybe an institution or a car manufacturer or a hospital or something like that. And that's, I think, because they're much more circumscribed sort of technical problems. And actually the reason that humans are being involved from a design perspective is really the performance, that they don't know how to fully automate the process in question. So whether this is self-driving cars, which given enough constraints and enough simplifying assumptions, yeah, we can get a car that stays on the road and drives through traffic, but there's just so many unexpected things that pop up. You want a human around to sort of be the zero on your phone bank that sort of handles all of these cases that kind of fall outside the normal, which are frequently enough happening in driving, even though it's an environment that we've really tried to engineer with a set of rules, painted lanes, signs, stoplights, and so forth. There's enough, balls that roll across streets and pedestrians who are in places they shouldn't be, that that we need that human to sort of manage it. And that becomes a very complex problem. And they get into that, I think, pretty well in the case study, as well as issues about trading off control between a human and a machine and the amount of time it takes to regain situational awareness and to take control of a system that's operating at a certain level. And in the medical diagnostic case, I think it's even more obscure. Like, why do you want a radiologist per se to be responsible for taking a certain kind of medical image? If you have a doctor who's going to later interpret that image, we might want them to be responsible. If your concern is about medical liability, we might be more concerned about the insurance that the doctor has or that the hospital or clinic has. Why would you want to sort of pin it on this particular radiologist? Of course, if they're making lots of mistakes or doing something wrong, you want that kind of feedback signal going back to them. But I think in that case, it's easy to imagine a fully automated diagnostic system. If it performed reliably and accurately, we'd be willing to say, yeah, in all cases, just use the software. Why do you want the meaningful human control? And I think in the case of the military targeting in particular, but I think there's also other cases around, say, eviction, denial of people to like healthcare or unemployment benefits or disability benefits, or many of these sort of government entitlements or human rights sort of benefits that you have, where you could be automatically rejected from, say, voter rolls based on some algorithm. Like, you don't want the algorithm kind of making that ultimate decision. You want a human who's responsible for that decision. And part of that is also a kind of due process question and a certain degree a right to an appeal, that you can say, look, I know the algorithm said I'm not qualified for this, but I think that's wrong, and I have this evidence, and I would like to present why I think I do qualify for this, right? And that this is a kind of an exceptional case or outside of the norm case, or what have you. So one, it's humans are capable of handling that, but two, that there's that actual mechanism in place for that. And I just find it harder to see that in radiology, and even they find that hard to see, I think, in the autonomous driving case, where why isn't it okay just to have the car manufacturer be responsible for all the accidents? Why do I have to be the owner of the car responsible? That's a system we've created because people drive cars right now, and so we want those people to be legally responsible for any damages that they do. But if they're not going to be driving the cars anymore, like, why do we want to hold them responsible? In the same way, we don't hold people responsible who are passengers, right? Or passengers on a bus or a plane. They're not responsible if there's an accident necessarily, unless they did something to cause it. And so if you're just a passenger in a fully automated, level 5, 6 kind of vehicle, then why would you be responsible? That is kind of an odd legal requirement. And morally too, like, why would we think that you were morally responsible? Unless, of course, you did something to change the programming of the car to make it less safe or something like that. Then you might have, that would be more akin to, say, drunk driving or something like that, where we would say you have some responsibility in the harms that resulted from that. But I think this comes back to a number of interesting questions, and I'm a little bit over 10 minutes, but it's worth it, and it's online, so digital is free, right? So I think the first question here, and the performance side of things, is the nature of human skills. On the one hand, where are human skills actually required because AI is completely insufficient to handle either the complexity or the specificity of certain types of tasks, that we don't know how to automate them yet, and so we want humans there to kind of carry their skills out. And to me, this is this kind of Sully Sullenberg story, right? That the designers of the airplane never figured both engines will be knocked out by birds at once. And he's incredibly experienced professional pilot with many, many years of experience, successfully lands the plane in the Hudson with very little time and notice. And that, a machine would never be programmed probably to do that. If he had made the other decisions to go to one of the nearby airports, they would have fallen short and probably died or crashed into buildings or things like that. So we see, okay, here's the case. The human skill is absolutely necessary to kind of fill in the gaps of the tech, right? But then as we sort of progressively automate, what happens to skill? So one is the sort of de-skilling that happens to pilots as more and more things get automated, and newer generations, younger generations of pilots don't have that kind of experience. So even if we kind of keep those interfaces, are they going to be successful? Will they have those skills in place? I think another way to think about it is, are the AIs that we're creating and training actually gaining their skills by learning human skills, right? That we actually need the human examples and the humans to figure out and do the real innovation to create the skills that we can then figure out how to automate. And if we, again, start de-skilling, stop allowing that kind of innovation, are algorithms going to become innovative enough on their own to kind of fill that gap, or are we going to reach a kind of stasis in terms of the development of new skills And typically when we automate things, you're just kind of freezing it in a box, and that's fine. You can build additional things on top of that. But it's generally taking what humans are doing or what innovation and skill they have and automating that. And this comes to also questions about hidden work, which they touch on briefly in the diagnostics, where having a conversation with your radiologist or your doctor is actually a crucial part of the diagnostic process. And it's not simply getting, the best image possible, and understanding certain things about the individual. And this, of course, when we get into biological systems, there's an enormous degree of complexity. And while it's nice that we have lots of data and statistics on how humans are in various ways, each particular human is different and their anatomy is slightly different. And how you adjust a diagnostic X-ray system to get a good photograph of them could depend on the kinds of maybe car accident they've been in or had some other kind of injury, have some slightly abnormal anatomical structure or something like that. The human is able to sort of adapt to that, but there's all this kind of hidden work that goes into tuning and tweaking technologies to work effectively, as well as the interpersonal communications that happen, particularly in medical interventions. And that a lot of the value of the medical intervention is that discussion with your doctor, not just the data that the doctor extracts or the diagnosis that they put down. And that often in medical diagnosis, you're talking about multiple factors, multiple symptoms, all of which have a certain sort of clusters of probability that we think it might be this, we think it might be that. We're going to do this test to try to narrow it down. We're going to use this drug to see if you respond to it or not, and so forth. And so it's not this exact science of there's just this right answer. We're going to find the precise one. But we're actually going to try a lot of different things. We're going to sort of navigate a very murky probabilistic space. And at the same time, we're building the values in, and this is where the morality side comes in more, because what you're also doing, I think, when you have those conversations with your doctor, is that there's not a simple single answer to what to do in terms of an intervention for whatever the diagnosis might be, or whatever your confidence in that diagnosis might be, right? You may have a different sort of set of preferences over quality of life versus length of life, the expense of a medical procedure, the pain or suffering you might experience through the procedure or afterwards, the risks that are involved and how much risk you're willing to take or not take to alleviate a problem. How much you want to change your lifestyle in order to prolong your life, and so forth. And those are not questions for which there is some right answer, right? These are questions that are a matter of moral choice and personal choice and judgment about what you value in life and how you want to proceed in your life. And those choices are really, I think, the essence of morality. And that's where machines can't do morality, right? So both on the sense that they don't have necessarily any values. I mean, we can build or hardwire or pre-code those, but who decides that? And that whoever decides that is not you. So that's somebody else's morality, not your morality. So that seems wrong to kind of impose it on that hand. On the other hand, like those agents are not responsible. Machines and algorithms, right? They just get coded a particular way. They do a certain thing. We might be able to sue a manufacturer here or there, but ultimately they're not a responsible human being, and they're not engaging with you as a human being and asking you how you want to govern your life, what your goals are, what your autonomy is about. And I think those are the cases where we really want to have meaningful human control much more involved, and whether that's questions about education and helping people learn and choose careers and what classes to take and things like that. Yeah, I mean, you could write a recommendation algorithm that recommends classes to students in a cookie cutter way, But ideally, every student is different and they have different interests, and being able to actually engage with them as humans and discuss that, and then figure out what their life goals are and how to fit that to, some courses or a degree, or how, to navigate a medical diagnosis and what kinds of interventions might be best for them, right? That's where you really want the human element. And then, of course, in the case of autonomous weapons, because you're deciding to kill, and as they note, this is irrevocable, it's not easily fixed, right? It's a kind of absolute decision. The burden there is much higher. And I think you absolutely want a responsible human being involved in decisions to take human lives. And that's different than just getting into an accident in a car. Because you design the car to never have an accident, ideally, right? And you're aware that it'll happen, and you put in all kinds of safety mechanisms, but you're not out there deliberately trying to kill people. Trolley car problems aside, Jason, that's not the goal of auto design. And so I think there is a somewhat different moral shift, moral burden there. And similarly with the diagnostics, and that's where I think, right now it's driven, both of those cases are really driven by the performance side of it and not the responsibility side. Like, we don't really need the responsible person in there, say for the diagnosis, but for the medical kind of intervention, like, what do you do based on that diagnosis? And then I think also that question of, do you really need the human understanding of what comes out of these diagnostic systems in order to make those kinds of decisions, right? So I was also thinking about like the Star Trek tricorder kind of example, where I guess Bones actually interprets the little bleeps and blurps that come out of the tricorder. But if you have the machine that just perfectly diagnoses your medical conditions all of the time, what's the role of the doctor, right? Well, they're not diagnosing you, but they still have to decide like what to do to heal you or to intervene. And that's, I think, where most of our concerns fall anyway. But we want them just to have the best available kind of information. And then there's this question, right, of both morality and of law. So I think one part of that is accountability. And this gets into this questions of what's explainable. Can the algorithms explain what's going on so that I, as a novice, can understand it on the one hand? Or can they explain it such that an expert like my doctor can understand it? And so, as long as the algorithms can sort of do that, then that's okay. That's accountability and explainability, but not responsibility, right? Responsibility means if we have a grievance and if we're harmed, then there's somebody that we can hold responsive, right? And that might be punishment in the extreme form. But it's crucial, I think, for many government systems and things that bear on our fundamental human rights, that there is, in fact, responsible people. Because if we allow the derogation of any of those kinds of rights without anybody being responsible, we're in a very hazardous kind of situation and territory. And again, questions of appeal and due process. And those, I think, if you think about broadening the application of meaningful human control to a whole range of algorithmic decision making, thinking about, okay, when can people be evicted from their homes, right? We might have algorithms that are going to make up these lists of people, but those people should then be reviewed by humans. So there's been some lawsuits in the States from the 2008 financial crisis about robo-signing eviction notices, where banks were just mass mailing eviction notices spit out by computers without any human review, which is illegal and should be illegal, because you want the human to actually review it, to check that there's no mistakes, and then also that there's an ability to appeal that. So if you think a mistake has been made, and in many cases, people were sent eviction letters who didn't even have mortgages and things like that, right? So how are you supposed to get evicted from your house if you don't even owe anybody any money on it? So, and then what is the due process there? And then ultimately, I guess, in terms of the morality of kind of personal morality, systems that prohibit you from expressing your autonomy and personal morality are problematic. systems, of course, and I think they do a pretty good job of this, that allow people to exercise poor morality are also problematic. So I think it becomes very complicated to think about how we really want to build human responsibility into these systems, avoiding things like moral crumple zones, avoiding things like at least explicit and also implicit and structural bias and racism and things like that, that can kind of sneak in with the person. But at the same time, respect us as humans who have autonomy and want to exercise that through our actions. And I think that's the sort of bit of meaningful in the meaningful human control that doesn't get fully explored in this paper. So I think that leave it at that.
Awesome. I guess so now it's my turn to give a bit of a response. So Peter, thank you very much for that very thoughtful reading and for those really insightful comments. And a lot of those things, I took some notes while you were chatting. I think a lot of those things are, also things that we kind of identified and struggled with in the process of this paper. Because I think, we started it out. I have to give a shout out to the Summer Institute on AI and Society at the University of Alberta last summer. And we got together and we started thinking about, this idea of meaningful human control, and starting from this place of, we started from more of almost a design place, looking at, what is this idea of meaningful human control? How do we get there? What are the benefits to it? What are the threats to it? And what are the design factors for it? But as we got more into it, I think that explicit question of upsides and downsides came more central to our conversations, and I think ultimately came more central to this paper. This question of, we often just sort of assume that meaningful human control is something that is needed in systems, but why might it be needed, and when might it be needed, and sort of what are the consequences, of that? And I think in particular, we definitely strive to be sort of agnostic in this paper on, whether meaningful human control is necessarily a priori a good thing or a bad thing. So it's like you rightfully pointed out, the case studies we chose were both case studies wherein the responsibility related components of having human control actually weren't as important, and it might be worth us being more explicit in our revision for this. But really, a lot of the times when we think we want responsibility, we actually want performance. I even point out when you said you want a human being to review the robo eviction notices and see if there's any mistakes, that could be cast as a moral issue of due process, but also be cast as a performance issue. It could be cast that the issue with, Wells Fargo evicting somebody who didn't have a mortgage at all, the issue there is actually a performance and about the sort of mistake minimization. And I think it also brings into this discussion the fact that, in these sort of complex socio-technical systems, this is something we struggled with when we thought about the narrow and the broad meaningful human control, is that, that barrier between human, machine, and institution is actually very tricky. Like, it's very easy when you have, one person sitting at a computer doing a specific thing to draw that line between human and machine. But then what if the responsible entity is a board of human beings, or a medical school, or whatever the group of people is? You start to run into more difficulties and start to run into more complexities, I think, of actually defining those barriers and defining, how do you exert meaningful control at the sort of individual level. And so I think scrolling through what I wrote down, I think definitely I liked your criticisms on our sort of the definitions. Those points 1 to 5 were something that we struggled with and agonized back and forth on. And in particular, you brought up the question of, to what extent do we actually need to know or understand the consequences, or to understand the downstream impacts of the system? And I think for us, the reason we included that was because we saw that as sort of a part of the meaningfulness, a extension of not being in a room just pushing a button, that to some degree, we can't have perfect till the end of time understanding of the butterfly effect impacts, but to some degree, you not only need to do something as the controller, but you need to understand enough about the system to know what the impacts of that are going to be. And we didn't explore it in massive depth here, but I always saw this as there being two sides of the coin, where one side is the issue of acting, being able to exert control, being able to slam the brakes and stop the car, etc. And that is something where, we think, okay, are we going to remove the steering wheels from our Teslas or what have you? But I think on the other side of it, which is precisely that understanding piece, is actually potentially the more complex thing as you start to get into complex systems. As you get into systems that are designed by their very nature to do things that humans have no capability of doing. When you get into, for example, a system for managing, I don't know, a complex nuclear plant that is reading thousands of sensors all at once. The reason we have that computer is so that it can read 1,000 sensors all at once for 24 hours a day. But we are trying to put a human in here for these edge cases. And this is, I think, is where that tension of the trade-offs comes in and the tension of the handoffs really starts to come in, where, how can somebody have meaningful control and oversight over something that they don't necessarily understand? And I'd point to point 5 specifically, that idea of it not being pre-programmed or pre-decided, I think is to us, not necessarily that it's not a normative claim so much as it is a descriptive claim of that division between broad institutional meaningful control. So, do you have institutional mechanisms to update your softwares, to review, to understand how you've embedded your values into this system, versus that proximal, narrow, meaningful human control that I think we're trying to focus narrowly on here. And as you pointed out, I think there it's the performance side that really drives it. Thinking, can you adjust as the operational context changes? Can you adjust as the moral context changes? And can you really be that sort of responsive entity that you need to be? And I guess I'll end this. I'm completely unsure about the time, but I'll end this and move back into discussion with the idea of the idea that I think came to us in this paper, that, like you rightfully pointed out, when you have a fully automated vehicle that's traveling at, very high speeds and whatever, we wouldn't want necessarily to have meaningful human control in that scenario, or certainly not proximal meaningful human control. Same way that you don't necessarily need anybody on the automated subway train to be liable for what's going on. And I think we're fully in agreement there. But I think there's this space in the middle, and that's what we tried to dial down in on partnerships, where it gets a little more difficult, where you have the case like that Tesla autopilot case where the individual crashed into the side of a semi-truck because even though Tesla says keep your hands on the wheel and focus at all times, a number of human factors issues makes that very difficult. It's very difficult to do this oversight of sort of a semi-autonomous space. And I think a conclusion that we drew, and I'd like to hear your thoughts on, is essentially where there is human control, we want it to be meaningful. So you can have a system with no human control whatsoever, no or proximal human control whatsoever, if it's a high enough performance system or what have you. But if we have humans involved, it can only give a false sense of security and actually essentially have all the downsides of slowing things down, of decoupling the system, of reducing predictability, without any of the upsides. Like, if you're going to have a human in that driver's seat, they need to be prepared to adjust to and respond to those sorts of circumstances. And I thought that was going to formulate neatly into a question at the end, but I guess, has that prompted any more thoughts in you about, I guess, how we draw those barriers and whether that statement of if there's human control, it better be meaningful, whether that applies?
Yes, and more. So, I mean, I think that's the right direction to move in, but I think it's even more complicated, right? So, and I think you're right where you're talking about also the idea of the sort of low level. If you think about control, it's actually happening at these very different levels, right? Mm-hmm. And decision making and policy making. So you have this sort of low level engineering control, which is maybe just feedback servo mechanisms. And that seems like, yeah, we're totally fine having full autonomy there. And it's often, not accountable or explainable in a certain way, right? Like the engineers can explain how the servo mechanisms work. And even in like the systems in our cars today, from the cruise control or the anti-lock brakes to the stability control or, early autopilots, these are stabilization systems like the thermostat in your house. It just stabilizes things. And, obviously cruise control won't keep you from crashing your car, but it allows you to not think about the gas pedal. Right. And we're totally fine with like these levels of automation. Again, though, we're relying on that individual to be there to sort of carry the burden of a lot of other things. But then I think also when we're thinking about this, like there's a level of control at a kind of organizational level, where you're talking about a hospital or a corporation or a military, where there's, command and control structures, and there's a lot of different people involved. responsibility is sort of shared, but a lot of what those organizations are developed to do is coordinate those behaviors. And so they have rules and norms and laws and values and all of these sorts of things to kind of control people's psychology to an extent so that they're more likely to do the right thing in the right context or be more productive or what have you. And at a policy level too, right, that we're trying to shape laws so that we get certain kinds of policy outcomes. And that sort of levels of control are very, very different, but often in these discussions of meaningful human control, we just kind of blur all those things together. And I think that's part of that complexity. And we do this also with these psychological terms about decisions. And, is the thermostat really deciding to turn on our air conditioning and our heater? Or, it's just a switch that gets flipped when a certain set of causal conditions are met, or sensor data happens to cause something. And so I like to think of those really as automatic systems. These are automated systems. They respond to sensor data in particular ways, and we are confident that the world is predictable and reliable enough, and those mechanisms are predictable and reliable enough that they're going to do the right thing in most of the situations, and it's not going to be too terrible if there's a mistake, right? But when we get these much more complex kinds of actions and behaviors and activities, like that starts to break down, right? And so maybe we depend on human knowledge and skill or other things, but I think it's also very different at a kind of a policy level when you're talking about trying to implement a law to govern people's behavior. People react in a lot of different ways, and so you can't necessarily just control people the way you control a thermostat. And that's just sort of the nature of human autonomy in a sense. Yeah, so I think that's important to keep in mind too. But I mean, what the exercise of going through those cases and I think expanding this to other cases does is really make you think about, why do you want human control? Is it the performance? Is it responsibility? And then what are the sort of parameters and requirements of that? And then is that going to shift, right? So as systems become more capable or data becomes more available and that we can train AIs or machine learning to do more and more things, are we still going to want humans in control? And what are they going to be in control of? And why, right? And I think human behavior shifts over time, so there's going to be certain social interests that might shift. You allude to that a little bit. With the elevators, that we didn't used to trust automated elevators until they put a stop button. I mean, how many of us ever press the stop button? Very, very few. Most of us, I don't think about that today when we get into an elevator, like whether there's a stop button or not. But when they were replacing elevator operators, that was an issue, right? So there's also these kind of social constraints and things. So, but at a case-by-case basis, I think it's really helpful to think about as a design process. Oh, that was the other thing. So you very much take a design approach throughout the paper and a kind of engineering approach throughout the paper. And that's, I think, very useful to an extent, but to keep also in mind, because it comes up a lot in the debates at the UN around meaningful human control, that's just one of the perspectives, right? So there's also the operator perspective, and there's also the policymaker, organizational director perspective. And so when you're building any real world system, a lot of decisions get shaped and made by these kind of higher level things, right? And so even decisions about sort of automated vehicles or self-driving cars, like why do we think about those at all? What problem are they really trying to solve, right? And it's like, well, if we had mass transit, whether it's human controlled or automated, we wouldn't need these individual vehicles, and a lot of these problems would just kind of go away, right? If we just sort of change the whole framing of the problem. If we had some kind of, medical diagnostic tricorder that could just tell you every possible disease that you have, like we wouldn't need radiologists at all, right? So why would we set up some system to preserve radiologists if there's also potentially some completely different technical system in which they don't even have a role, right? And I think that's true for a lot of different kinds of socio-technical systems. But I think there's also these sort of features of humans that are not going to change, that are a little bit more consistent over time, that we're still always going to want humans doing certain kinds of roles, even though, I think like judges, if we look at the law, right, like judges make a lot of bad decisions too, and they're humans, they're fallible, but I don't see society really wanting to replace judges with automation anytime soon, because that's definitely a case where we want that kind of meaningful human control, and that sense that the human who understands the law and understands human foibles and complexities has sort of overseen a process in a just way. And that I don't think, feel more confident that some automated process is ever going to do that.
And that's something that we thought deeply about, and I have yet to find the proper language for it. I don't know if the term sentimental value or what have you seems almost glib, but it's this idea that there's something we intrinsically value about having another human being involved, and whether that's something that's on just simply a cultural level due to our trust for computers. Perhaps we get to the Jetsons stage where the robot maid is treated in a very similar way to a way a human would be treated in terms of like characters having conversations with it or what have you. Or you look at the psychology around things like that. Eliza, I believe, was the name of that bot in the 60s. That was an incredibly simple machine, yet people could have conversations with it. Or I think about GPT-3, where, it does, knowing whether it's a human being or not on the other end of the line, that Turing test question, make a difference. And I think that's something that we are really confronting on multiple fronts going forward, and we will be confronting going forward. It's that question of, if, say, we had a machine that would always output the same judgment as a human judge, or even, better if we had some objective metric for that, is that something that would be desirable or acceptable, even if all of those metrics are all right? I, I'm a medical student myself, and one of my professors speaks about how we've had some form of physician for thousands of years in every culture on the planet. Even before physicians could do much biomedically to, cure a lot of diseases, we didn't have antibiotics or what have you, there was still a value to having a human being who listened to you, who was empathetic to you. And I think it's really an open question as to whether a machine facsimile of empathy will ever be as existentially soothing or as, able to fill that role, just for that, like you pointed out, that sort of almost intrinsic human need to have connections to other humans. I guess hard for me to say whether or not it's intrinsic or whether it's just born of the vestiges of a society where we didn't have robots that were empathetic enough to make us feel all right. Thinking about stuff like the film Her, where you have all these characters developing these intensely emotional relationships with something that they know is not human.
Yeah, I mean, I come down on that as sort of, it's more important to think about the humanity side of it, right? And like, what is it that makes us human, and why do we want these human relationships? And not simply reduce it to, well, we have a certain psychological reaction to other humans, and then we can make facsimiles of humans, and then we will react the way we react to those. And so we can just kind of substitute them in. And it's like, that's true from a behavioral perspective, but then from the kind of deeper human perspective, it's not true, right? And so you are getting something that's false or artificial in that sense of, if you want true human connection, you're not going to get it with a machine because it's not human, right? It doesn't experience mortality, doesn't experience the sort of aging process and growing up and the hardships of life, and it just doesn't really understand, even if it can regurgitate text and act as if it understands. And that can be fine for certain things, and maybe a lot of our human relationships aren't very deep either, and that's been true throughout history, but holding out that possibility, and similarly with the morality stuff, right, that you can't always just assume that all humans are moral agents, right? Which I think at some point in your paper you just say, yeah, humans are moral. Well, some of them are, right? And to take even a sort of Kantian morality where it's a huge challenge to become a truly autonomous moral agent in this framework, that it's you have to sit and think about all of these things all of the time. What are the implications of your actions? What sort of principles are you acting on? And can you universalize those for everybody in the universe? And is that okay? Right? Like, we don't actually expect most people to do any of that most of the time. And yet we have all of these sort of expectations of what it is to be moral, and what's right or wrong, and can sort of clearly say, like, that's not right, even if we can't quite explain what's not right about it in certain cases. And that's just part of our kind of human psychology as it's adapted to morality. And that's why I think, machines aren't really going to be moral. We can make them imitate morality. We can make them follow, certain programming that results in decisions that we would call moral if certain humans made them in certain conditions. But all of that has to be buried under all of these qualifications and assumptions. And it's not really an agent defining its own rules for its own life and deciding how to live until it is, right? Maybe they reach that point. I think that's, an extreme kind of technological challenge, because we don't really understand why it is or how it is we do that as humans. But I don't know that it's impossible that we could make a machine. And if machines do become self-conscious moral agents, then maybe we have to, treat them very differently and consider them as a new kind of being in the world and all of that, which it also doesn't necessarily mean they're human. They may be superhuman. They may, have other properties that, if gods walked on the earth, we wouldn't necessarily treat them as human, right? They would have all these kind of crazy new capabilities and properties.
Well, and I think you bring up something really good there, which I think is, these philosophical questions. It's why I was drawn to the We Robot type of story in general, because I think not only do we think about the subject, but we think about the more fundamental issues we're dealing with. Like, you start to ask about, you talked about the difference between accountability and responsibility. And it's that question of, is responsibility a consequential concept? Is responsibility important because you have, if you have somebody who is going to be punished potentially or face consequences or what have you, consequentially they will be more careful or what have you? Or is it that deontological concept that I think you also alluded to, where there is just something intrinsic about having a human being be responsible? And even if we could have, I've read all sorts of wild work about the idea of making a robot that can, I don't know, buy and sell and trade stocks and be this completely autonomous thing. Even if we could somehow punish that entity by fining it, taking its money away if it directed a company a certain way or what have you, have we lost something deontologically in not having a human being be that agent of responsibility? Or similar to how, if an animal kills somebody, there might be a response. People might say you need to kill the animal or what have you. But in our current framework, we don't necessarily blame the animal. Nobody would think that a bear is an evil entity if it's very hungry and it eats a human being, because we vest that idea of responsibility only in a specific class, which is human beings.
Yeah, and while I think there's good reasons to sort of assert certain rights for animals, we don't necessarily want to give them all and exactly the same rights as humans. Like, I don't know who the chimpanzees are going to vote for, but right, like, why would we want to create artificial agents that have those kinds of rights anyway, right? And so this question of creating an autonomous corporation or investing machine, like, who's ultimately responsible for it? The idea there is to remove the responsibility, and there are these sort of things existing as what do you call them? Blockchain style trading systems, and of course, somebody steals all the money from it. Who's responsible? Well, no, the idea is they created something where nobody's responsible for it. Well, why is that a good idea, right? And corporations were created to limit the liability of people, but we don't want to completely eliminate that liability, because then and already the limited liability means there can be quite dangerous to society, right? So further eliminating that liability or responsibility, I think, is very dangerous in sophisticated kinds of systems.
Yeah, well, I think, this has all been very illuminating for me. And I think that, in some ways as authors, we hand waved away by saying, well, we're focusing on the narrow bit in this paper. And, you have to, have to sort of draw those lines of scope somewhere. But I think, there really is that question. I think that's the tension we got to here, is that meaningful human control is something that can be good and can be bad at the small organization, at this individual level. But like you said, we take a design approach, an engineering approach, less of a policy approach, but we can't forget that these are socio-technical systems that are always being engineered in a certain way and for a certain purpose. If we are automating our radiology diagnoses, there are reasons we are doing that. There are reasons why we might want human control and we might not. And I think something we try to identify and emphasize in this paper is that it's an explicit choice, or rather it should be an explicit choice. You shouldn't want meaningful human control and then accidentally, fall prey to these various human factors problems that make your system not function in the way in which it's supposed to function. And I think remembering that there is that sort of agency at the institutional level is really important. And in our allusion to moral crumple zones, I think that makes that very explicit, where you can have all these discussions of individual agency and all these discussions of individual responsibility and everything vested down at this level of those partnerships. But I think it's important to remember the context in which those partnerships are built, the background against which those partnerships are built. And I guess if I could say anything final on this paper and on what we're trying to say here, is really that meaningful human control is one of these things that is clearly very important in certain contexts, but is not something that can just be blanket assumed to either fit everywhere or to function well everywhere. And that, like you alluded to earlier, that case study, case-by-case approach, I think is probably the best way of approaching this. What in this, especially when you're using the lens we've used in this paper of, should this be a partnership? And then within this partnership, what should we do here? And I guess I'll just also, because I don't think I did effectively enough at the beginning, deeply thank Jackie, Sophie, Dallas, Brent, Judy, and David for all of their incredible hard work on this paper. Thank the AI Pulse people for their work in setting up the event, the 3-day conference where we sat in a room and talked about this and led to the genesis of this. And of course, to thank you, Peter, you, Jason, and everybody else on the We Robot team for all of your amazing adaptation to make this happen, despite, as the old cliche goes, unprecedented times.
Well, with that, I will thank the both of you, Peter, Liam, for being here again. Everybody for in the We Robot background there, Florian, Katie, who is not with us today, couldn't be with us today, Katie, who is with us today, and Widad, who's helping out. Thank you both for agreeing to do this, for contributing the paper. I thought it was a great session, and we'll wrap it there. Until next time.